everybody, if I could ask you to take your seats, please, and we'll get started. It's my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Gregg Easterbrook. He is the author of the bestseller Sonic Boom, Globalization, and Mach Speed. He is an author and contributing editor to the Atlantic Monthly, the New Republic, the Washington Monthly, and writes for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and a column on politics for Reuters. And during the football season, he writes a sports column for ESPN. He's a former visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution and a distinguished fellow of the Fulbright Foundation. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Gregg Easterbrook.
Thank you, Phil. I come from Washington, so let me start with a Washington joke. Barack Obama, Tony Hayward, the CEO of BP, perhaps you've noticed him in the news, and Sarah Palin all die at exactly the same instant, possibly because they had the continental breakfast at the Naval War College together. Because they die at exactly the same instant, they come before God to be judged at exactly the same instant. So they're sitting before the celestial throne. God turns to the president and says, Barack Obama, what do you believe? And Obama says, I believe in hope, and I believe in dreams, and I believe in change, and I believe in dreams of change, and I believe in hope of dreams, and God says, okay, we get it. You've lived a good life. Come sit by my side. And then he turns to Tony Hayward and says, Tony Hayward, what do you believe? And Hayward says, I believe the ocean is very big and the oil is very small and nobody's ever going to really see that oil. Nobody's going to say anything about it. Nobody's going to notice. God says, all right, you've lived a good life except for that. Come sit by my side and be careful not to spill anything. And then God turns to Sarah Palin and says, Sarah Palin, what do you believe? And Palin gives him a beady-eyed look and says, I believe you're sitting in my chair. I'm here to talk this morning mainly about the ideas in my new book, Sonic Boom. I have committed author's mistake number one by failing to bring it to hold up, but it's called Sonic Boom and you can find it easily enough. It is a mainly optimistic book about the near future for the United States and the world. Not entirely optimistic, I'm no Pollyanna, but I mainly think the world is going to continue to get better, and we'll give you some of the reasons in a moment. But I will tell you, this is obviously not the mainstream view. Mainstream commentary is quite pessimistic. In fact, I read a book on the plane coming up here that was really pessimistic about the near future of the United States. It said that technology was running amok, that the educational system couldn't keep up, that the pace of change was overwhelming, that some terrible episode of destruction lay ahead, and that the United States cause was basically lost. And that book is The Education of Henry Adams, written in 1907. People have been saying this at least for centuries. In fact, there's a fine book with a name that's hard to pronounce, American Jeremiad, by Sack Van Berkovich of Harvard, that documents that basically since European settlers arrived on our shores 300 years ago, people have been predicting the imminent eclipse of the American prospect. It hasn't happened yet. I don't think it's going to happen in the lifetime of anyone here in this room, but it is certainly the most common thing to hear. I think otherwise. Now, let me give you my reasons, but I will warn you, Phil mentioned that my hobby is that during the fall I write a football column for ESPN. It's a quirky sort of project, but the motto of my column is all predictions wrong or your money back. And I will say, I will give you and the column is free, so you would get, well, anyway. I will give you the same caveat about what I'm about to say. History teaches us that when some crisis interrupts a larger trend, when the crisis ends, the larger trend resumes. Right now, we're at the back end of the 2008 financial crisis. It was a real problem. But what were the larger trends before that crisis? What larger trends are in the process of resuming? The larger trends were dramatic increase in global prosperity, most of it happening not in the United States and European Union, but in the developing world where prosperity was most needed. Dramatic, very rapid increase in global economic growth, especially in the developing world, rapid increase in global education levels, literacy and youth education, especially for girls, the most neglected educational problem in the world, rapidly improving, rapid increase in the human lifespan, rapid increase in ease and cheapness of communication. We talk constantly about global trade. Let's not forget global communication, just as important. Rapid increase in global access to information and knowledge, and most importantly, a rapid, and nobody saw this coming, increase in the level of freedom in the world. Obviously, many nations, the movement toward democratic government or free speech is halting. Russia's the best example. It's not a tyranny anymore. It's certainly not a democracy. What is it? It's hard to say. But gradually, haltingly, stumblingly, they're moving in the right direction. Those are the larger trends in progress before the financial crisis began, and they are the larger trends that are reasserting themselves now. Especially, I think, the trend toward more prosperity and more economic growth, especially in the developing world where it's most needed. We don't see it here in the United States, where our economy continues to grow at a relatively slow rate, and where personal income rises a little bit all the time, and our living standards rise a little bit all the time. You go around the rest of the world, China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, you see personal income and prosperity rising extremely dramatically. And it's in the rest of the world where increase in prosperity is most needed in order to have a just and equitable ordering of the world's resources. Why is it happening? Well, there's a lot of reasons. Electronics have things to do with it. The end of the Cold War have to do with it. But at the most fundamental level, as recently as 50 years ago, only the United States and Europe and a few other nations used high-yield agriculture and high-efficiency manufacturing. Most of the rest of the world used subsistence agriculture and very inefficient labor-based forms of manufacturing. Now, almost all of the world is in the process of transitioning to high-yield agriculture and high-efficiency manufacturing. What you would expect is a very rapid increase in global prosperity. And that's what we're seeing. That's what we will see more of. Again, you have to go to the developing world to experience it yourself. But when all or almost all of the world uses high-yield agriculture and high-efficiency manufacturing, we're going to see living standards rise very dramatically across the world. And we've always known that democracy and living standards go together. One reason I think that this will continue to accelerate in speed, and in fact it may accelerate to the point that it makes our heads dizzy, is that you may not like globalization. I don't like globalization. Globalization is just getting started. We are in the early phase of globalization. All the things that are beneficial about globalization, easy, cheap communication, efficient manufacturing, low prices, et cetera, all those things are going to get better. All the things that drive you crazy about globalization, the stress, the anxiety, the sense that there's no place on the earth that you can go to escape from whatever's going on, all those things are going to get worse. Network effects. You may be sick of hearing about network effects, including in the military. Network effects are just getting started. The world is nowhere near as networked as it's going to be very soon. Electronics, you may be sick of hearing about them. I'm certainly sick of trying to upgrade my computer. Electronics are in the early stage of development. Most of the cheap miniature electronics that we use today, the super advanced gizmos that you've all got in your pockets as cell phones, they will seem rudimentary to teenagers in 20 years. And the acceleration of technological change is going to happen in large part because of increased trade and increased global communication. The late economist Leonard Read used to say, "No one knows how to make a pencil." And he meant that in the literal sense, that there wasn't anyone in the world that you could put him in a room and say, here's some resources, make a pencil. Nobody knew how to do it. Obviously, everyone knows what's in a pencil. Everybody knows roughly what a car is. Even extremely complicated devices, a nuclear submarine. You can all describe generally what they are. None of you know how to make one. Technology has shown itself to advance through incremental groups of knowledge that are brought together by large numbers of people. And what's the movement in communication right now? To allow large numbers of people more easily to communicate on complex technological projects. So we should expect the quality and complexity of our technology to accelerate, although nobody will know how to make any of the stuff that we use. There's a good book that just came out by Matt Ridley called The Rational Optimists, that argues that trade is the greatest pusher of innovation, technology, and science in human history. It's a big scope book that starts with the Stone Age. I've never written a book that starts with the Stone Age. That one does. But one of his big arguments concerns why China, dynastic China, which was the leading power of the world 1,000 years ago, ceased to be the leading power of the world. And his answer is that it closed its borders to trade. Europe did not. So Europe's trajectory accelerated, China's trajectory slows. Well, now we have the entire world doing what Europe did 1,000 years ago, opening its borders to trade, communication. We should expect everybody's trajectory to accelerate. In fact, we should expect trajectories to skyrocket. I'll tell you two more things that are important that's going on. We all agree on the centrality of ideas in the advance of human progress as well as technology. The world supply of ideas is about to skyrocket. For generations, up until this generation in some countries, 2 generations ago in other countries, women were essentially forbidden, or in effect forbidden, to participate in science, engineering, business leadership, government leadership, etc. Now that's changing in most, not all countries, and we can reasonably expect that over the next 50 years or so it will change in all countries. This will double the world's supply of ideas. Doubling of the world's supply of ideas will double the world's rate of progress, or somewhere in there. We should also expect that human institutions, as women contribute ideas to them, will become more woman-like in nature. And is that such a bad idea? That doesn't sound like such a bad idea to me, considering how men have handled the world for the last few thousand years. At the same time, we'll just simply find that ideas originate in the developing world. Our conception of how the global economy should be ordered right now is at least that Americans and Europeans and Japanese have ideas, and people in other nations build the stuff. The people in the other nations are going to be the ones having the ideas. Multinational corporations, you already see this. India is a great source of innovative engineering thinking. Other nations are learning to do innovative engineering thinking. In Sonic Boom, I talk about Embraer, the Brazilian aircraft manufacturer. You may not know it. You've probably all been on Embraer products. Embraer aircraft are advanced modern aircraft, and they are designed in Brazil by Brazilian engineers. That's Brazilian technology you're riding. In fact, it was Brazilian technology that I rode to Providence Airport yesterday. Increasingly, we'll find that ideas come from the developing world, and this will increase the world's supply of ideas. I think this will mainly, although not exclusively, lead to good results. I think it's amazing how mainly the trends in the world today are positive, even considering our economic problems, and you don't often hear this from the media. One of the key questions in life is compared to what? We are where we are today compared to what? Or in other words, what didn't happen? We talk endlessly about what did happen. We don't talk about what didn't happen. Well, what didn't happen in the years that I've been alive? Superpower confrontation didn't happen. Nuclear conflict didn't happen. In the last 30 years, inflation hasn't happened. Inflation is a disaster for the average person. We've forgotten that inflation is it used to be a big factor in global economics and has largely been banished by the globalized forces that everybody drive us crazy. Crop failures haven't happened. Anybody heard the word crop failure lately? The last time we heard the word crop failure was the Soviet wheat failure of 1979. Advanced agriculture had made crop failures unlikely, although certainly not impossible. Anyway, they haven't happened in 30 years. I guarantee you if there was a large-scale crop failure anywhere in the world, that this would rapidly displace all other issues combined in global discourse. And global anarchy hasn't happened. Someone in the audience mentioned my friend Robert Kaplan, who writes for Atlantic Monthly and is a wonderful man, but is the most pessimistic man since Thomas Hobbes. He sees he sees the end of the world on every page of every morning's newspaper. And if you go back, and since you mentioned Robert, in 1995 he had a cover story in Atlantic Monthly, my favorite magazine, that was called "The Coming Global Anarchy." That story basically predicted that by the year 2010 the world will have ended, that China and India would have collapsed and become ungovernable, the Hobbesian civil wars would be destroying most of the world, and the United States would be on the verge of disbanding by about now. And that article did really well in popular opinion. All the East Coast tastemakers liked it. Bill Clinton, then the president, invited Robert to the White House to talk about, oh yes, the world is going to end in 15 years. It's easy to be wrong. Trust me, I have plenty of experience. But If you want to read a well-regarded article that was totally wrong, every single sentence in the entire article, go back and read The Coming Global Anarchy. Didn't happen. Now, yes, it could happen in the future. There are nations that could dissolve into anarchy, but I don't think so. And you don't see evidence of it in world events today. I'll give a spectacular counterexample. Poverty and malnutrition have declined to their lowest levels in history. This is all United Nations figures. Declined to their lowest level in history in the last 10 years, even though the human family has increased by a spectacular number. Everyone thought that poverty and malnutrition would get worse because of population growth. Poverty and malnutrition have declined during the period of population growth. And here's the UN numbers. 30 years ago, there were 2.5 billion people at the level of medium development, what the United Nations considers reasonable physical sustenance. Now there are 4.2 billion people at the level of medium development. That's 1.9 billion added in 30 years at a reasonable level of education, healthcare, etc. That's more than the total number of people who lived in the world in the year 1900. We've added that many in 30 years at a reasonable material standard. The world hasn't fallen apart. That's no guarantee the world won't fall apart. But if you look at the evidence around you, the evidence around you is that the world's not falling apart, and probably most things will continue to get better. Now we feel tremendous anxiety about our economic system because the rate of change is head spinning, and the rate of change certainly is head spinning. But consider a recent example. 100 years ago, 70% of Americans worked in some aspect of agriculture. If we had held this meeting 100 years ago and said in the year 2010, 2% of Americans work in some aspect of agriculture, which is, as you've guessed, the correct figure, everybody in the audience would have said, country's going to fall apart. There won't be any jobs. Everything will be ruined. We can't possibly do that. Well, today, 2% of Americans work in agriculture, and everybody, including farmers, are better off. We're now entering the same transition with heavy factory manufacturing. We see heavy factory manufacturing jobs declining, and they clearly are. We've lost 6 million manufacturing jobs in the United States in the last 20 years. It's scary. It seems like the economy will fall apart. It seems like nothing will be at the bottom. China, in the same period, has lost 28 million manufacturing jobs. China is losing manufacturing jobs much more rapidly than we are. The driving force in the loss of manufacturing employment is not decline in manufacturing. Every year, every product category sets a new record for production. It's the rising productivity and technical efficiency of factories that simply requires fewer people. And it's felt more keenly in China than it's felt here because Chinese factories were less efficient than ours when this period started. Now, this is a big social disruption, especially if you work in a factory, if there are factory workers in your family. This is a period of intense social disruption for you, similar to what the period of intense social disruption was 100 years ago, or actually more like 80 years ago when we began to move toward high-yield agriculture. But it has always been inevitable, regardless of what trade policies were or global politics were. It has always been inevitable that factory employment would decline. We're simply learning to live with it now. If you look at Stuttgart, Germany, which is the Detroit of Germany, we all praise German cars, BMWs, they're so flashy, they're so great, they've got everything our cars don't have. Their rate of factory employment loss is just about identical in the last 20 years to Detroit's, and this has been driven by improving technology in factories, not by trade policies. Well, the factory job loss, which is terrible if you're in that business, results in more prosperity for society as a whole. More prosperity for society as a whole is good. In the same period that we've lost factory employment, we've seen a dramatic increase in employment in the United States and in Europe in school teachers, healthcare workers, sports coaches. We need more school teachers, healthcare workers, sports coaches, and in other professions. Declining employment in one place is rising in another in most cases, as long as the economy overall is becoming more prosperous, and that's what's happening. Of course, the sense of economic upheaval drives us all crazy. We all wish that change would stop. I wish that too. Sonic Boom is structured around, each chapter begins describing a city that's undergone some wrenching change in some various parts of the world. And I can't do them all, but I'll do Erie, Pennsylvania, which is not all that far from here. 1852, Erie, Pennsylvania was the hub where before standard gauge railroads, where 3 railroads of differing gauge met. And that was right about the middle of the 19th century was the movement towards standard gauge. People in Erie, Pennsylvania didn't want standard gauge railroad because there was a tremendous business there, offloading and reloading. The railroads would meet. You'd have to take the goods off one railroad, you'd add it to another one. If that standard gauge never came along, Erie, Pennsylvania would have been happy. So they broke up railroad tracks. They tried to enact legislation forbidding standard gauge to enter the city of Erie, Pennsylvania. You can imagine what happened. History passed Erie, Pennsylvania by. They were not successful in stopping change. No one's ever been successful in stopping change. There are many aspects of change that we all don't like. I could rattle off 10 for you right now. And if I decided that I wanted to stop change, how successful would I be? If Admiral Roughhead offered me the services of the United States Navy to stop change, how successful would I be? I would not be successful, would I? If you think, even in an outline form, the economic upheavals of the last 2 centuries in the United States, water canals and then railroads and then affordable steel and then electrification and then high yield farming and then mass ownership of cars and then telephones and then electronics and then liberal global trade. Our economy has always been in turmoil. We speak as if this was some new unexpected development that suddenly things are in turmoil. We've always been in turmoil. Whenever you ask audiences or focus groups what they think of the economy, everyone says the same thing. Well, if it would just go back to that time when nothing changed. Okay, when exactly was that time? What was the year that nothing changed? In our memories, there was that time that nothing changed, and there was that time that we all looked better than we do today. And in our memories, there's a lot of that stuff, but if you look in history, you do not find that time that nothing was changing, and you never will. There was no golden age, at least for the economy. Today I think the country is experiencing 2 things happening at once that we think are related but actually are not in terms of employment statistics especially, which unemployment is our biggest economic problem by far. One is the residual effects of the 2008 financial meltdown. Those things are largely resolved. And secondly, we have declining factory employment and moderation of demand. Retail sales have been down for 3 years. Savings rate is up for the last 3 years. Electricity use is down. If you look at curves of economics of things that were completely rigid and never seemed to change, retail sales have been up every year for 50 years until the last 3 years. Electricity use has been up every year for the last 50 years. Savings rate's been down every year for the last 50 years except the last 3 years. All those trend lines have now changed. And maybe it's an after effect of the credit meltdown. Maybe it's that Americans are actually moderating their consumption patterns a little bit. If you go back and read the commentary of the 1990s, all kinds of people, including people like me, were saying that Americans spend too much and they don't save enough, and the result is stressful, constant financial stress on the treadmill of work and spend. Well, maybe people are getting that message. And maybe Americans are just moderating their spending a little bit and saving a little more. That's what the data show. We all said we wanted slow growth. We seem to be getting slow growth. We seem to be getting a more moderate pace of life. That's probably going to be good for us, but it is going to mean long-term structural problems in entry-level employment. It's going to mean that unemployment won't go down as fast as we wanted. Now, this may be good for, this could actually be a good leading indicator for the military because it'll improve retention. But if we all spend less and save more as a nation, which certainly sounds good to me, it could have long-term effects on our employment statistics here. Will the United States decline in importance in the world as a result of global forces? Oh, yeah, absolutely. And this is good. People get this all wrong. I think it would be great if the United States became less important. If we became less important because China, India, Brazil, Indonesia became more important, more of the human family live in those nations. If you look at our planet from afar and say, what is required for justice on this planet, your first concerns are just not going to be the United States and the European Union. Your first concerns will be China, India, the other nations that I just mentioned, and other nations beyond that. We want those nations to become more successful. We want them to be more prosperous. We want them to have more sway on the world stage. We will inevitably become less important as this happens, and that will be good because it will be just and equitable. It isn't something we should be afraid of. But does that mean America will decline to some sort of second power status, or that the Chinese will be the big gorillas and will be oh no, I wouldn't worry about that. America will still be the #1 country in the world for our lifetimes, our children's lifetimes, possibly for a very long time. It's just that our stature will get a little bit lower relative to the rising stature of other places. And certainly, if you've been to China lately, don't worry about China passing us anytime soon. China is the most zany society in human history, and I admire that they've done so much economically so fast, and I'm guardedly optimistic that they're haltingly moving toward freedom. But that society is so close to the edge of the cliff in so many ways. Don't worry about them passing us. I would just remind you, if we'd had this meeting in 1985, everybody would have been terrified that Japan was going to overtake us and become #1. All American thought leaders believed that in 1985, and nobody worries about that today. I think you can feel roughly the same way toward China. You can hope for their success. Don't worry about them passing us anytime soon. Military affairs, I was asked to speak on that briefly. Compared to the things that didn't happen, that we never read about, the #1 great thing that's happened in military affairs during my lifetime is the decline of the number of nuclear warheads on Earth. And nobody even talks about it. The peak number looks like it was, for strategic warheads, looks like it was somewhere around 60,000 in the late 60s and early 70s. Now down to a little under 10,000. It's about to go down again. The president just announced another extension of the arms control process that would eliminate another 3,000 or 4,000 strategic nuclear warheads in the United States and Russia. And the media reaction was, 3,000 or 4,000 nuclear warheads. Who cares about that? I'm just stunned that people pay so little attention to this. There is a related figure that also gets no attention, which is global per capita military spending. Iraq, Afghanistan, parts of Africa are spectacular exceptions to a general global trend of less combat. You don't get that impression from the news because you click on CNN and you see everything that's burning and exploding everywhere around the world. If you look at statistics, the last 20 years has been steadily less. There have been fewer wars of lower intensity, fewer casualties, both direct and indirect from combat. Your chance of dying through combat or any kind of violence right now is the lowest it's been in human history. That's only 20 years, maybe 20 years is not long enough period to draw a conclusion from. But I can tell you that if you look at statistics for global per capita military spending, these are current 2010 dollars. In 1985, per capita global military spending was 312. Last year, it was 194. Global military spending is trending down, and that's what we want. We want the United States military spending to trend down. We want everybody's military spending to trend down, and that's what we're seeing. One reason, of course, is the end of the Cold War. That's the main reason. Another reason is that there has never been a superpower relationship like the one that currently exists between the United States and China. Scan history in vain for the point at which the two leading nations in the world were not arming against each other, we're not scheming against each other, rather we're mainly cooperating with each other. Now, of course, there are all kinds of problems in the Chinese-American relationship, and there could be more problems coming. It's not ideal. China's government is pretty creepy. We find them hard to understand. They find us hard to understand. Yeah, someone mentioned the Chinese naval plans. Yes, China is building the sort of weapons that could make it harder for our Navy to operate directly in their waters. But they're not challenging us in the open ocean. They're not making any attempt at all to best our position as the strongest military in world history. And they are so intertwined with us economically, it's hard to put into words how close they are to us. Before World War I, people thought that economic interconnectedness would prevent war, and of course they were wrong. But economic interconnectedness before World War I was 2-3% of a nation's GDP tied to export and import. China now, they're 40%, we're 30%. We are so closely tied with them that yes, they have some sway over us, but if our economy went down, China would quickly descend into social chaos. If they tried to call on all those T-bills of ours that they hold, they would ruin themselves in the process. We are far more interconnected than the nations were before World War I. And we are also nations that are World War I is also, I think, the wrong analogy. Well, of course, I could be wrong. I think it's the wrong analogy because at that time, affairs of state were determined by the fits and whims of kings and kaisers. And that is not much of a factor in today's international affairs. So I think the Chinese-American relationship could be a huge failure at some point, Right now, you got to be pretty optimistic about it. When in world history have two great states related to each other the way China and America have? I can't think of an example. I'll tell you the next thing that would be on my mind in terms of what's going to happen in the next few decades. Climate change, we're going to have, the evidence for climate change is very solid scientifically. We could go over it if you want, it's very solid. No one knows what climate change will mean, but the evidence that it's happening is quite solid. And it's going to happen at the same time that we have tumultuous economic change. So we're going to have two forms of drastic change going on at the same time. Everyone talks about the environmental consequences. Yes, those are important. But think about what climate change will do to flows of money and power. Climate change should make high-latitude land more valuable. By accident of geography, all of the high-latitude land in the world is in the northern hemisphere. High-latitude land is Russia, Scandinavia, Canada, Alaska. That's where the high-latitude land is. Those places are likely to become more valuable. Equatorial nations, which with a few exceptions are mainly poor, are likely to become less valuable, harder to live in. Climate change is my biggest worry about disrupting the current mainly positive arc of developing world achievement. Russia could become a great power again if Siberia becomes habitable. You look at a map of the world, what is the biggest piece of land that cannot be developed? It's Siberia. The world gets a little bit warmer, Siberia might be developed. There could be natural resources, but probably are immense amounts of natural resources underneath Siberia. That land's probably tillable. It's never been used for controlled agriculture. The population continues to grow. Where's the one big place on Earth that can be tilled that's not being tilled? It's Siberia. So climate change could make Russia a superpower again. Climate change could, think about the biggest worries, the biggest worry by far is agriculture. The reason that the Malthusian calamities predicted for our post-war era have not occurred is that in every year but one, global farm yield has run ahead of global population growth. If that changed even once, even 1 year, the world could become an unhappy place. And climate change, even if the world just warms a little bit, it's not the warmth that we would worry about, it's climate change. If rainfall patterns shift in the world, that could be very disruptive short-term to agriculture. And we might not like the consequences. The northern polar ice is gradually melting. Nations of the world could be fighting over what's under the North Pole, or at least jockeying with each other for position within a couple of decades. Many nations claim that waters. It's not clear who has jurisdiction. People have fought over less. If you look at the map of the world and assume it gets hotter, Pakistan, where I've lived, my wife is a former FSO, Pakistan's already brutally hot. If the world gets hotter, Pakistan could become close to uninhabitable. Afghanistan's right next to it. It's high and cool. You look at Brazil, which is an overpopulated country and very hot. Argentina's right next to it. It's high altitude and cool. Climate change could cause military conflicts. And finally, I would ask you the question I think a lot of people are going to ask about global warming in the next 10 years. Global warming, what's in it for me? How can I make a profit on global warming? This is going to happen. This is actually already happening if you look at venture capital flows. People are going to try to figure out how to make money from a changing climate, and that will add another level of economic disruption to all the disruption that we're going to get anyway. I was raised in Buffalo, New York. In 50 years, Buffalo, New York may be the vacation paradise of the stars. Hollywood celebrities will sit sipping Chardonnay as they watch the sun set behind the old slag towers of the Bethlehem steel plant. At the same time that nobody wants real estate in Florida or Arizona. Can you imagine what kind of disruption that would lead to? Let me speak briefly about education. When people talk about what makes America great, besides our culture, our culture of freedom is what makes us great, but people talk about, well, what else? Is it our natural resources? Is it our oceans? Is it our really loud music? By far, what America has over the rest of the world is college education, high-quality colleges. You count the high-quality colleges in the United States, and you get a 10-to-1 lead, U.S. over all of the rest of the world combined. We are strong, we are free, and we put a lot of money into college. I don't think that this is just a coincidence. I think that those facts that I've just given you are closer related. Now, the rest of the world is beginning to notice. But we ourselves need to make a second level of commitment to college beyond that, which we've already made. If you look back to the 19th century, the great progressive movement of the late 19th century was universal public education to the age of 16. I mean, we're really glad we did that. It's one of the greatest things America ever did. Lifespans have increased. If you take the lifespan of today versus the lifespan of the late 19th century, we should have universal public education to the age of 23. We should have universal public education through college. It's going to be expensive, sure, but college is what made America what it is, and we need to make a greater commitment to college. Instead, we see, especially in the big public state-run systems, California, Florida, Texas, mainly, people are cutting spending on college. That's penny wise and pound foolish. College is what's putting us where we are, and I say that not just because I'm speaking at a college. I would have said that regardless. We need to alter the way we do education, all colleges. You scratch anyone in Washington or at any think tank and say, what do we need more of in school? I say, well, we need more math and we need more science. Schools have to get more traditional. I think we need less math. I think schools have to get more modern. Unless you go into engineering or one of the hard sciences, you will never use calculus in your life. I'm not complaining about this. I did well in math in school, and I've never used calculus in my adult life. Calculus is a way, especially the new emphasis on step back from calculus to algebra, the new emphasis, national emphasis on teaching algebra to the 9th or even the 8th grade. It's a way to make a lot of kids in school feel stupid and disengaged from school, trying to teach them a very dull, dry subject that will never matter to their lives, and it's obvious to them. I think we need less math in public schools. We need more economics. It is an outrage that you can, well, outrage is strong, it's a scandal that you can graduate from any public high school in the United States without having taken a course in economics. You need to know economics to defend yourself in a globalized world, and we are graduating millions of kids who know nothing at all about economics, and thus what do they feel? They feel lost and awash in a world that they can't understand because they're surrounded by economic forces, but damn it, they can do algebra. I think that needs to change. And at the college level, we need far more interdisciplinary college experiences and far less of the separation of colleges. You go to the typical college, the physics department never talks to the sociology department, which never talks, etc. It goes on. There are all these separate specialties. That's not how the world is structured. The world is structured so that everything is all mixed up all together at once. We need interdisciplinary colleges that will teach you a broad range of issues, and especially across cultures. Because with each passing year, it gets more important to be able to get along with people who come from a background who's dramatically different than yours. I'll give you an example. I have a daughter who's a freshman at the University of Chicago. She's decided to major in law and society. It's not a classic pre-law major. It's a major that teaches how legal systems influence the societies around them. That's a great major. That's the kind of major that every kid should be looking toward, because it helps you understand why China is different from the United States and why Taiwan's different from China, and et cetera. We need a lot more courses like that, and we need less traditionalism in that sense. I'll give you one brief warning about the federal debt, since Admiral Ruff had mentioned it. Secretary Gates at his Leavenworth speech said that military budget's got to come down, that he hopes to hold future increases to 1% over inflation. Let me tell you, that's the rosy scenario. It's likely that the defense budget's going to be cut. It's likely that practically everything, including, most importantly, Social Security benefits, are going to be cut. They have to be. There's a lot of worrisome numbers on debt, but let me give you the number that worries me most. So this is a today's dollars number converted to 2010. 10 years ago, U.S. federal debt was $6 trillion. Today, it's $13 trillion, more than doubled in a decade in real dollar terms. That means we've borrowed more money in the last 10 years than we borrowed in the previous 211 years. Obviously, that can't go on. Federal spending has just got to go down. You've all got credit cards in your pocket. You all know that by using that credit card, you could live for a month like a king. Maybe you could live for 2 months like a king. Tomorrow would come, and tomorrow would be unpleasant. America's right on the cusp of that moment. Tomorrow is definitely going to come for us financially, and it could be real unpleasant unless federal spending goes down and state spending as well, and it's going to affect you in the military. There's no way around it. I'll add one more point to that and then give you my final thought. You hear it said we're all Keynesians now in economic terms, and we are all Keynesians now. The Keynesian argument that when the economy is slack, government spending should increase to compensate, that's a very strong argument. Nobody has ever poked a hole in it. We are all Keynesians now. But Keynes didn't just say that, he said something else. The flip side of Keynes's contention is that when the economy was strong, government spending should decline to pay back the debt that you just incurred when the economy is weak. Do we as a country, does anybody in Europe as a nation have the national resolve to do that? All these emergency bills that we've passed in the last 3 years, will they become the new norm from which future spending demands are negotiated? Or will they be true emergency bills and then we'll cut back all the spending in order to pay down the debt that we incurred during the emergency? If Keynes was here, he would tell us now that the economy is growing again, federal spending must be cut back dramatically. And we are, after all Keynesians now. Let me give you a final thought. I believe that we're entering what I call an era of uncommanded institutions. And this may be particularly relevant to the military, but I think it's going to affect all of life, where you will see more and more social and political structures without a specific person in command. I'll give you a small example of this and then a really big example. The small example would be Wikipedia, which you've all used. Nobody runs Wikipedia. Nobody is in charge of it. And it's really useful, isn't it? I mean, it's actually more useful now than the old Encyclopedia Britannica used to be, because you can carry it anywhere with you. And it's improved in quality. It's not perfect, it has flaws. It's improved in quality very dramatically in the last 5 years. And man, the usefulness of Wikipedia is off the chart. Coming here this morning, in case I got a chance to talk to Admiral Ruffhead, I wanted to know a little bit about the ships that he had commanded. To answer that question 5 years ago, I would have gone to the Navy's website, and by 4 or 5 minutes of endlessly clicking on things, I would have eventually found one of the ships that he had commanded. 15 years ago, I would have had to go to a library and look up Jane's fighting ships. It would have taken me all afternoon to figure out any information about one of the ships he commanded. This morning, in my hotel room, I put CG-73 in the search box of Wikipedia, and I knew it all in 10 seconds. That outcome is produced by an organization that isn't run by anybody. I know Jimmy Wales, one of its two co-founders. Jimmy Wales I would say he has some influence over Wikipedia. He doesn't control it. Nobody controls it. Nobody could control it. We're entering a world where institutions are going to look like that. Maybe you can argue that in the past there were so few people who were well educated and so few people who had access to accurate and timely information that maybe the world once needed to be structured around kings and bishops and generals. That time has passed. We're entering a world where practically everybody will have access to current, timely information, and most people will be well educated. Maybe we're entering a world that will be uncommanded in some respects. Now let me give you the big example. Wikipedia, okay, it's just an interesting phenomenon. The big thing that's happening all around us, in fact, the biggest institution on earth, the global economy, no one runs it. It is an uncommanded institution. There is no headquarters of the global economy. Nobody's in charge. Nobody's setting a course. There's no plan. We don't know where we're going. Nobody has any idea where we're going. I certainly don't know where we're going. The media, because of the need for the narrative to have an individual striding into his office and giving commands, talks as if the president was in charge of the economy, or as if the chairman of the Federal Reserve was sitting in some master control room like the villain always has in a James Bond movie, turning the dials, affecting the economy. The president doesn't control. The president has no idea what's going to happen in the economy. And it's not because it's not just President Obama. His predecessors had no idea what was going to happen. They did not control it. They have some influence over it. They don't command it. The Federal Reserve doesn't command the global economy. Nobody commands it. Not the trade minister of Singapore, not even the CEO of Walmart. Nobody is in charge of the global. No, this is true. And I think one reason we feel such stress and frustration about the economy is we want to know what the plan is. We want to know what's going to happen next. We want to know who's in charge. And the answer is there's no plan, nobody's in charge, and we don't know what's going to happen next. And that's why the economy is a source of stress. And yet, since the war ended, the economy has done this uncommanded institution has done a remarkably good job of raising global prosperity, of providing far more employment, far more food, far more material goods than anybody ever would have guessed. at a price most people can afford, extending the human lifespan, increasing global access to education, bringing freedom, not everywhere, but pressuring for freedom, and increasing literacy is way off the map. That's almost a minor one at this point. Literacy was a big problem 50 years ago. Now we've probably practically forgotten it. All these things have been achieved by an uncommanded institution with no headquarters and no one in charge. And this is why I am mainly optimistic for the future, although I have a talk on all the things that are going to go wrong, and I'll give that talk some other time. Thank you very much. Questions? Happy to do questions. Okay, you can be next. Over here.
Ellen Windsor, Jamestown Town Council.
Okay. And what's your question? Oh, okay.
Ellen Windsor, Jamestown Town Council.
Okay.
One of my thoughts for the United States is I think we need an entrepreneurs and innovators think tank on a national level, similar to the WPA with President Roosevelt, but not on capital expenditures or bridges, that kind of thing. I think we need to, in a formal way, unleash America's ingenuity. And that would be across incomes, across races, and I don't know what you think about that.
I will tell you, there already is an entrepreneurs think tank. It's the Ewan Marion Kauffman Foundation of Kansas City. They exist to encourage entrepreneurs. They love the word entrepreneur. And take your questions to Kauffman. And more importantly, they are privately funded. Government has nothing to do with them, thank goodness. Other questions? In the back? Anybody?
Janice Marconi, Marconi Works International. Last December, some of you are familiar with ITSIC down in Florida, primarily modeling and simulation, mostly Department of Defense. But it's been kind of expanded, medicine, things like that. I decided after attending this conference for the last 8 years, I would sit in on the high school track. I'm doing modeling and sim. Now, these are high schoolers. These are not MIT grads, what have you. What they came up with, for example, and they were international, they were national, it didn't matter. One of the simulations was the effect of architecture on urban sprawl.
Okay.
Another one was the effect of fatalities and casualties in the Indian train systems, again, high schools. Another one was a chemical process of some sorts. And the thing is that when I went back, I got all the information I needed. This is not my line of work, but in Connecticut, there's as in a lot of states, there's a lot of predominance on robotics, first competitions, things like that. But there is not a lot of emphasis on modeling and simulations. The way I look at it is, you can have laboratories made out of molecules, the hard laboratories, but you can have simulations made out of electrons. And you can have teams of cross-functional kids. So it doesn't have to be just the engineers, the geeks, the nerds. It could have, like your daughter, on judicial systems and the effect on what have you. And I think what happens is that, so what happened is that we're starting to put together, it's just really at the infancy stations, trying it in southeastern Connecticut.
Can I ask you to ask a question, please, ma'am?
Well, it's just an observation about the fact. Just an observation about the fact is that you can get a more cross-functional education team that actually rises all boats within the education field. That whether the kid goes to a 4-year college or 2-year college, or is actually employable right out of high school, it can be done.
Okay, thank you. I can tell you that when we simulated this meeting, my jokes were a lot funnier. Anybody in the back? Can somebody take charge of asking questions? Anybody in the back, please?
Okay. Kathleen Branch, retired manager of advanced engineering. I have some major concerns concerning your paradigm concerning mathematics and your statement. Given the fact that mathematics is obviously critical in decision process, calculus is required for fundamental decision-making in economics. I would like to understand how you have come to that paradigm that we need less of it when mathematics has been critical in problem solving. I've used it every day, from everything from building a deck extension to triangulating in an aircraft. So how can you justify your statement concerning needing less when technology is founded on it?
Yes, if you're in a technology field, if you're an engineer or a scientist, you clearly need to know higher mathematics. Most people do not. And I'll tell you that to get a degree in public policy at any big university, especially a postgraduate degree in the United States, you have to take advanced math courses. You got to be able to do regression analysis and so on. When you get to Washington, you never use that stuff. I mean, just never. Nobody does regression analysis in Washington. So I think it's more important to teach economics and cultural studies.
This will be the last question.
I have a question. I have a question. I have a question. I wanted to thank you very much. I've been to this session now. This is my third time. Your presentation probably was one of the finest I've heard. And I want to really congratulate you. I would thank you very much because you said a lot of very, very important things. But I do have a question for you, and that is, and I want to disagree with this lady over here, by the way. I'm a graduate of the United States Naval Academy, class of 1949. My name is Richard Glickman. And I see something that I'm wondering about. I know that the United States has done a wonderful job in preventing the use of atom bombs. And we have a crazy guy who has an atom bomb, and for a number of years we've been preventing him from using that bomb because of our, let's say, economic power, which he has needed. Now we have a different situation. In the Middle East, a man who has the economic power, and he's working very hard on an atom bomb. We seem not to be able to prevent him from succeeding, from reaching his goal. What is your best take on what's going to happen?
Thank you. First, thanks for your comments, and I'll give you the $5 during the break. I assume you mean Ahmadinejad, the leader of Iran. The things that I worry about, by far my greatest worry is that sometime during our lifetime, some sort of crude atomic device will go off in Washington, D.C. It is a very large worry. Deterrence has worked so far, at least, because states are rational actors. States do not want to commit suicide. You can find individuals who do want to commit suicide. So there is some fear of a crude weapon going off in Washington, D.C., which would plunge the world into darkness in many, many ways for many decades. As regards Iran's nuclear program, the military men and women in this room know a lot better than I do that thinking about how you would attack Iran's nuclear program has not been terribly productive. It would require not some quick bombing raid or a couple of cruise missiles, but many weeks or months of very intensive use of ordnance, and your best case result would be that you would discourage Iran or slow them down. Meanwhile, you would kill Russians in the process. There's a lot of Russians at Iranian nuclear installations, and Russia, rightly or wrongly, views Iran as a client state. If Russia attacked a client state of ours, we would not take it kindly, especially if they killed Americans in the process. We did the same thing to Russia. What might relaunch the Cold War, and the problems caused there might be greater than whatever you would achieve by slowing the Iranian nuclear program. I wish I had ever read an analysis that came to a more optimistic conclusion than that. So. Is that good?
Thank you. Greg, thank you very much. That was an outstanding speech. We're a little late, so we're going to take a break, but the break, instead of ending at 10:15, will end at 10:20 now. So we'll start up again at 10:20.